Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where we just finished listening to a great panel on the Arctic and America's role in it. And we've got with us Heather Conley, who's here at CSIS, who directs the Europe, Eurasia, and Arctic program. Heather, great discussion. Obviously, Senator Dan Sullivan, Republican from Alaska, was there. Admiral Gary Roughead, Jim Townsend, from recently liberated from his Pentagon assignment, obviously, as a key Europe policy assistant secretary. Talk to us a little bit. You mentioned and discussed that the Obama administration had essentially finished the new national Arctic strategy, the Arctic defense strategy. That's been delayed a little bit from being announced. You guys had hoped that you would be unveiling it here. What do you're familiar with that strategy. Is it the right strategy? Does it say the right things? And how should it shape what how the Trump administration should look at its Arctic strategy?
So Arctic strategy is really preparing the United States for the future, a future of an increasingly ice-free Arctic where economic opportunities are going to be explored, but where we have to protect American sovereignty and protect the American people. So what this new strategy does, it provides more detail, first and foremost, what other Arctic nations are doing, how the United States looks at some potential challenges in the Arctic. And what makes this study important is that the Obama administration largely didn't want to talk about the security dynamics and the potential of militarization of the Arctic. Unfortunately, we wish we didn't have to talk about it, but the fact is there are growing security dynamics in the Arctic that affect U.S. national security interests. It's about preparation. It's about making sure that the United States can protect its coastal waters. It's preparing for that increased shipping activity, fishing activity, cruise ships, that if Americans are on board a cruise ship that heaven forbid something happens to it, that the United States can rescue those citizens. I mean, that's how fundamental it is. So it's a great next step in providing enormous amounts of clarity, but we have to go farther. It doesn't put the budget, it doesn't list the priorities, it just continues to underscore we need to do more, but it doesn't have a detailed plan to act on that and to implement that new plan.
It was interesting when you mentioned that because it's rather startling for people the distances involved, whether it's from Anchorage or Tacoma to get up to that region. And it was fascinating that, the requirement is essentially to be able to save 50 people, much less a couple of thousand who might be on a very thin-hulled cruise ship going through ice-infested waters, as you were saying, as one of the panelists was saying, on the anniversary. I think it was Senator Sullivan on the anniversary of the Titanic sinking. What do you think, the Trump administration, obviously just the first few days in office, but the climate section was deleted from the very prominent climate section, which you could even take back to the robust climate section that existed, in your administration and the Bush administration. Talk to us about how the climate debate, the challenges and views of the incoming team on climate could influence the thinking of the new administration on the Arctic.
Well, how CSIS and how I approach our Arctic research is it's not necessarily about a debate on how the change evolved, whether it's man-made, natural, a combination thereof. It's to recognize that change is happening. And all you have to do is look at the satellite imagery of the polar ice cap to understand there's an enormous amount of change that is happening. So what I'm hoping the Trump administration will do is look at U.S. economic strategic interest in the Arctic, see those opportunities and implement increased infrastructure in a sustainable way. In some ways, this is allowing Alaska and officials that have been doing this for hundreds of years, developing the economy, growing jobs, but doing it in an environmentally sustainable way. That's the path. It's a balance. And so we're hoping that there'll be a little more focus on what an infrastructure package would look like for the Arctic: deep water ports, runways, hangar space. This is to protect Americans, protect the state of Alaska, but also look at economic development, but do so in a way that is sensitive to the environmental challenges that Alaska itself is facing. I think, the balance can be found, and it doesn't necessarily have to solely be conducted through the lens of climate change, but you cannot deny that the reason we're talking about Arctic security developments, economic economic developments, political developments, is because there have been so great significant change in the Arctic because of climate.
Obviously, Russia is a major security driver. Obviously, the militarization that we've seen up in the region. Russia has been reactivating old airfields, building new airfields. Senator Sullivan talked about, the 6 new brigades. 4 of them are Arctic brigades, rapid reaction, surge exercises to put tens of thousands of troops up there, thousands of vehicles, ships, what have you. How does the United States best counter that? Is the first part of the question. And I do have a follow-up then in terms of how maybe the new administration may be looking at Russia and how that will affect the picture up there.
So what Russia has done strategically is it has understood that the Arctic is such a geostrategically important region to them, not just for the economic regions, which is understandable. Russia has over 50% of the Arctic coastline. The Northern Sea route has the potential to be an important shipping route. The oil and gas resources, the mineral resources, the fisheries, it's an economic driver. And so Russia has a very ambitious economic plan. It is also focusing on its military posture. In some ways, I think it's trying to recreate its posture during the Cold War, which obviously significantly atrophied over the last 25 years. So it's reinstating airfields, bases, special forces. It's putting combat commands, surface-to-air missiles. And you sort of scratch your head and going, wow, that's a lot of military. Some of that is for the economic development, the search and rescue, and that's totally understandable. But, a significant portion of this is about preventing, in my view, access by the U.S. or NATO into these areas, the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. That's so important to U.S. Security issues. So your second question about the future of U.S. policy towards Russia. We simply don't know. We will have to wait to see how the Trump administration proceeds. We know during the confirmation hearings we've heard very different messages about Russia. We've heard different messages about NATO than President Trump's. I right now am watching Congress very closely because I think increasingly this will be a strategy that is legislative in nature. It, very much as Senator Sullivan suggested Arctic policy is. It's been more directed by Congress. That may happen more and more, but I think we're just going to have to wait and see. And it's not just U.S. bilateral policy towards Russia. This impacts every region, Europe, Asia, the Middle East. So there is so much more at stake than simply the U.S. bilateral relationship with Russia.
You said that it's unclear, and obviously, what the new president's thinking specifically is on Russia. Obviously, some of his cabinet secretary nominees during their confirmation hearings said very reassuring things, whether they were Jim Mattis, whether it was Rex Tillerson, whether it was Nikki Haley, in fact. But all of them also conceded that they hadn't had detailed conversations about Russia with their boss. Almost everybody in the American security establishment, or many of them, were urging President Obama to get involved in Syria. And yet his views on the topic stopped that from happening. Could we see a situation where that happens? And what are the potential implications of a U.S. strategy, which he's already articulated in his inaugural address of America First? And what does that potentially mean? I mean, as a Europe hand, as you are, among your many other past roles, how does that change the debate at a time when you have right-wing leaders growing in a lot of the nations that are absolutely core to U.S. strategic interests, not only in Europe, but worldwide?
Well, we're all sort of wondering and watching how the Trump administration in some ways will organize themselves and where the centers of power and authority are going to be on foreign policy. Very typically, every administration has a more White House-centric policy where it's driven by the president's key advisors. That was certainly true under President Obama. It was a little less true under the Bush administration, but it's still a very White House-centric focus. This is what we don't know, whether the cabinet secretaries will play a dominant role in formulating that policy and seek the White House's approval, or the White House will say, no, this is the policy and you will implement it. So we're going to have to see. There were such contradictions. I think it's it's unclear. So we're going to have to watch for that to unfold. And I think that's where some of these very early meetings, I'm watching very closely Friday's meeting with British Prime Minister Theresa May and President Trump and what he says about allies and NATO and the importance of it. So we'll be looking for those clues. Your question, I think, is so important, and you're going to have to remind me of it again.
Oh, no, well, I was saying that the timing,
I had it in my head.
the timing. Oh, that's right. I have so many things in my head that I normally wear earplugs. Well, specifically, that there are right-wing movements that are growing. Obviously, they met in Koblenz.
Oh, the America First policy.
And so how does the America First policy at this time with what's going on there and potentially lead to very, very bad consequences? Because every American president, whatever you wanted to say about them, always put America first.
Of course.
They never formally said it because U.S. policy was to try to shape global events in our interest. Ultimately, even if it gave another guy the sense that we weren't putting our interests first. What's the best way to balance to look at this, and what are the potential implications, especially at a time when right-wing movements, many of them funded, by the way, by the Kremlin, let's just be brutally honest about that, are trying to seize power to break the very order that Vladimir Putin looks as antithetical to his interests?
So I think this demonstrates U.S. foreign and security policy is America first, because it is our country's interest that we always maintain and protect. That is our first order of business. I think what has happened over a period of time, we have not explained that in a clear way, that when we have alliances, the reason that NATO was built under U.S. leadership, and the reason that a U.S. general is the supreme allied commander in Europe is because a secure Europe is in U.S. strategic interests. Allies make us stronger. They make us better. And so we have to explain this very clearly. I think we've just done a terrible job, and so the narrative is turned into the allies aren't paying enough. They're pulling the strength of the United States. No, our allies are our strength. They have to do more, and that's where President Trump, like every leader before him, has called for Europe to spend more, and they are spending more. But to suggest that an isolationist policy is America first, that's where I think we've gotten off track a little bit. Let's remember, America First began as a movement to avoid U.S. involvement in the Second World War. What happened? Pearl Harbor. What happened next? The U.S. became involved in the Second World War and created the structures out of those ashes that make the United States more secure. So if we even look at the historical underpinnings of the America First program, and then ultimately what happened, America First began because we create these incredible alliances that magnify U.S. power and its interests. So that's what we have to do a better job of explaining, and I think once Mr. Trump really sees how this works, he will understand that our allies equal an America First policy.
Heather, thank you very much. I know you've got to run, and we'd love to talk to you again on this. Thanks again.
Perfect, thank you.